everyone. Happy New Beer, and welcome to the 5-Beer Plan. I'm Brian, and this is the ongoing saga of Everyman's Ale Trail. In this episode, I kick off the 2025 Ale Trail with a Seattle Beer Fest review, lay out the next homebrew project, continue my Western theme with Robert Beezer from Wyeast Labs, and review an Imperial Oatmeal Stout from Fremont Brewing. But before we get this party started, here is this episode's burning question. What is your favorite Imperial Oatmeal Stout? My favorite is one called Double Astral from Third Eye Brewing in Cincinnati, Ohio. This beer won Kelly Montgomery and his brew team a gold medal at the 2023 Great American Beer Fest. I was happy to get my hands on this one straight from the brewery. It is deep and dark with a chocolate-forward nose. It has a silky smooth mouthfeel with a great dark chocolate goodness. If you find yourself anywhere in the Cincinnati area, be sure to look up Third Eye and try this beer. In this segment of Tales from the Trail, a good fortune falls on my lap with a Winter Beer Fest in Seattle, Washington. In previous segments, I have shared my fondness for and connection to Seattle. Yes, it's the home to Microsoft, Boeing, grunge, and Starbucks, but the beer scene there is one of the best. I just had no idea how much more my appreciation for the region would grow. This past month, I visited my soon-to-be 96-year-old mother-in-law to celebrate this big milestone. During the week, I split time between work and family. One of the first nights there, I dropped into a new local craft brewery called the Good Society Brewery and Barrel House. While I was sitting at the bar, I was talking about the podcast with Shaban, who was behind the bar, and Jen, who was also sitting at the bar enjoying a beer. During the conversation, Jen asks if I'm going to the Winter Beer Fest. I was like, the what? She went on to explain, the Washington Brewers Guild hosts a Winter Beer Fest each year. This year, it would be held at Victory Hall at the Boxyard, which was right across the street from T-Mobile Park where the Seattle Mariners play. This year, there would be 40 breweries and over 150 beers represented. It was a 2-day event, Friday night and Saturday afternoon, with 3 hours for each session. She thought it might be sold out. So I finished up my beers, went back to the house, and mentioned it to my wife. She said I absolutely needed to try to get a ticket. I told her initially I would look into it, but since we were leaving early Saturday morning, I was not sure it was a good idea, but I said I would sleep on it. She asked me the next morning while visiting Mother if I had procured a ticket, which I had not. I told her I thought it was sold out, but I'd look into it. My first glance at the website showed it was sold out, but then I quickly realized it was the pre-sale tickets that were sold out. It looked like there was still availability. I went ahead and purchased a ticket for Friday and went back to my workday. About an hour later, I checked the Washington Brewers Guild Instagram feed and saw that tickets were sold out. I had gotten my golden ticket just in the nick of time. Now I was getting excited. Friday couldn't come quick enough. After a pizza dinner from Zeke's with the family, I took a lift down to the venue and got in line for the general admission. Many were repeat attendees and were dressed in ugly Christmas sweaters, Santa hats, and the like. There was an undertone of excitement, as this was the first time the fest would be held at this venue. I had no idea what I was getting into. I got my wristband, grabbed my taster glass, and made my way up the steps to Victory Hall. When I entered, I felt right at home. What a great venue! The early bird attendees were just finishing up as we in the general admission began to intermix. The guild had provided a Google sheet with all the beers with descriptions in advance. I was glad that I had done a little bit of prioritizing ahead of time and made a list. Other winter beer fests that I have attended tend to have barrel-aged and higher ABV beers. This one was not any different. However, I planned to stay away from too many of those so that I could make some connections for the podcast and enjoy the camaraderie. I also planned to make it my focus to try beers from breweries I had not visited previously. The layout was kind of like a trade show, with breweries set up on either side of two long aisles. The third shorter aisle had a map, a booth for the Washington Brewers Guild, and a photo booth. Though the event was sold out, I never really felt like there were too many people. Each brewery had also decorated their respective booth for Christmas, so it was very festive and fun to see what each one had decided on. Of course, there were lots of lights, pine boughs, and even some of the intentionally named beers. There was a contest also for the best decorated booth voted on by the attendees, but honestly, I don't recall who ended up winning. So I started to do my thing, weaving my way through the crowd, trying beers, chatting with the brewery reps pouring the beers, and passing out cards and stickers to spread the word about the podcast. I picked up a lot of swag in the form of stickers, coasters, and business cards. I also managed to taste beers from 28 different breweries, which was pretty incredible. Some of my favorite beers from that evening were the following: barrel-aged Sherwood Imperial Coffee Stout from Meteor Brewing Company. Three Rise Men Apple Pie Barley Wine from Reuben's Brews. Sweet Potato Ale from 23rd Avenue Brewery. Frosty's Nuts Winter Warmer from Acorn Brewing. And finally, LGBTQ Rye Beer from Jellyfish Brewing Company. The 3 hours went by way too quickly. As I exited the venue into the cool Seattle night, I was grateful that I was able to experience this event. I met a lot of great people and tasted a lot of great beers. I'm working hard behind the scenes to try and line up some interviews so that you can hear for yourself what kinds of things are being done on the West Coast in the craft beer industry. And to the Washington Brewers Guild, congrats on a great event, and thank you for making my holidays merry. In this segment of Homebrew Hijinks, it's time to share the next project. When I first visited Buckeye Brewcraft, my wife went into the store with me and threw down the gauntlet, buying some different adjuncts to use in my homebrews. One of those adjuncts were cacao nibs. Yeah, I can work with that. So that got me thinking about what might work with the cacao nibs. The first thing that came to mind was a chocolate stout or porter. As I began to look into recipes online, I found a standard porter recipe that had been one of the monthly kits offered at Buckeye Brewcraft. It was a 5-gallon kit, but David helped me convert it to a 1-gallon size. Once I had this base recipe, I did some further research and was able to modify it to accommodate the addition of cacao nibs. Enter the small-time chocolate porter. Next time, I mash in. Now, it's time for Barstool Banter. This episode, I head to the Columbia River Gorge to find out more about yeast from Robert Beezer, who works for Wyeast Labs. I will warn you, the conversation gets a bit technical and scientific, but I think you'll find it interesting, as there is so much that goes into operating a commercial yeast lab. Welcome to Barstool Banter. I'm sitting down with Robert Beezer from Wyeast Laboratories in Odell, Oregon. Robert, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me on the podcast.
Yeah, no problem, Brian. Happy to be here.
So can you please tell me what your role is there at Wyeast Labs?
Yeah, so I'm the quality and regulatory compliance manager currently. So most of my duties are overseeing our quality program, including managing our QC lab, which includes 3 lab techs. We're a pretty small team, so do a whole lot here, and yeah, it keeps me busy every day.
Excellent. How long have you personally been there at Wyeast?
I've been in this role for a little over 3 years now, and I spent a year as a lab tech as well. So I've been here for a little over 4 years total.
And how did you end up in the yeast business?
Yeah, so pretty serendipitously, when I was in school, I was studying biochem and thought I wanted to be a doctor. So I kind of went down that route. Eventually decided to pivot and started applying to grad programs and ended up getting into a research laboratory at Washington State. There was a fermentation lab. My advisor was a wine microbiologist. We were studying mostly wine spoilage, a lot of Brettanomyces work, but I happened to have a project involving yeast nutrition and cider fermentations. And so kind of got pretty interested in the microbiology side of fermentation. And coming out of school, I had been doing some home brewing and knew about Wyeast and was wanting to get back into Oregon. So they happen to have an opening in their QC lab, and like everything kind of fell into place pretty well. And so I got my first job out of school here at Wyeast.
Okay, that's pretty awesome. Like you
Yeah.
said, it is very serendipitous. It's amazing where beer can take us.
Yeah, definitely. It was never the plan all along, but one thing just falls in front of the other and you end up somewhere that's a good fit for you.
Absolutely. So you actually had used the Wyeast products then in your own homebrewing along the way.
Yeah, most of my time in grad school, I was doing some home brewing with the roommates, and we had Wyeast products at our local homebrew store, so I was pretty familiar with them at that point, and it was kind of the first company that popped in my mind when it was time to find a job, and worked out pretty well.
Great. So
Yeah.
how long has Wyeast been in business?
For quite some time now, based on my math, I think it's 38 years or so. They started in 86. Yeah, it was started by our founder and current GM, Jenny Kraft. She has a background in food science and stock culture maintenance. And so she eventually decided to apply that background to the brewing industry at a time when craft beer in the US was kind of just starting to gain some traction. There was definitely a need for a domestic yeast supplier who's providing a lot of the yeast cultures that are preferred for craft brewing. They weren't really available prior to Wyeast's inception.
So Wyeast was one of the original vendors then for getting yeast commercially to homebrewers and professionals alike.
Yeah, for liquid yeast, for sure. Dried yeast companies have been around for a while as well. They're a little more limited in the strains they could offer, just because not every yeast strain can survive the drying process. So, to provide a lot of these unique strains that craft brewers were interested in, liquid yeast became like the preferred product. And so, Wyeast was pretty much in the forefront of that for the beer industry.
Yeah, I was looking at the website and just for beer alone, I think there were over 60 that I counted for yeast strains just for craft beer. So that's pretty amazing. And then you also have strains for cider, for wine. I think you also, did I read, offer them for distilleries as well?
Yeah, we've got our work cut out for us. Yeah, it's a balancing act for sure, maintaining all these stock cultures as well as trying to keep a perishable product like this in inventory and trying to keep our lead times down for our customers. It's a challenge.
Yeah. I know the first time that I had used one of the Wyeast products, I think it might have been a West Coast ale yeast or something. I was at a homebrew store, a new one I'd never been to, and up till that point, I'd been using dry yeast. And the guy was like, "Well, the only thing I have in that particular style is the Wyeast." And I was like, "Okay." I've been homebrewing for just about 2 years, and my batches are 1 gallon batches because it's just so easy to turn it over and play around with things. I get this big package of, the yeast, and I'm like, the liquid yeast, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with this? So I reached out to a couple professionals I knew, and they're like, yeah, we'll probably just use maybe a third to a half of the package in your beer when you're doing it because that'll be probably more than sufficient. So that was my
Yeah.
first exposure with like the live yeast cultures. And it was kind of weird if I'm going to be honest with you. It was like pouring trub out into your fermenter. So it was weird, but at the same time, I believe it's probably a little bit more efficient product because it's live. You don't have to wait for it to activate and get to work immediately. So I think that's a pretty cool aspect of it. It's just crazy to think about just the endless possibilities with yeast.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. If you can get into yeast isolate pretty much from anywhere, we can propagate it and we can sell it. Yeah, we're definitely one of the huge benefits of liquid yeast is the number of strains that we're able to offer.
So historically speaking, I mean, how did you amass all these different variants of yeast along the way?
Like I said, we've been around a while, and we've got lab notebooks that are almost 40 years old now. That are some of them have records of how they came to be in our collection. Some strains are somewhat of a mystery to this day, kind of lost in the archives of time. But for the most part, most of them were given to us by craft brewers of the 80s or isolated from various beers. So every strain has a different story, but for the most part, they're all historical strains that were used by emerging craft breweries in like the 80s or 90s, and they'd let us know that they've got this house strain that they've been using for years and they like the profile and it gives them in their beers, and they send us a sample and tell us that we can add it to our culture and sell it as needed. That's kind of generally where they mostly came from. Yeah, each strain has kind of a unique origin story, and then I probably don't have time to go through. But yeah, you got to do a little bit of historical work to kind of figure that out. Actually, for most of them, there's a lot of good lore on the internet actually of what strain came from where, and sometimes maybe those homebrewers on the forums know more than we do. So
Sure. That's pretty cool to think about the fact that you've got yeast strains that date back to the birth of craft brewing here in the US. I really think that's kind of cool. So you're able to maintain those. I mean, so even you've got yeast strains that you've kept alive, quote unquote, for 40 years then in your archives?
yeah, definitely. That's kind of the backbone of our business is our culture collection and maintaining those cultures. That's a lot of what I do as well. If you want to go into that, I mean, the process of archiving.
Yeah, sure. I was going to say, I mean, just thinking about that, I mean, even with just the 60 that you have that you offer for sale currently, it seems like a massive undertaking to be able to maintain those. So, in the quality area and what you're doing there, I mean, how do you maintain that and keep those straight and not letting them get cross contaminated and become unviable? I mean, there's so many things that can happen.
Yeah, and those are just the public strains that we offer. We've got, oh man, I don't even know how many different strains are in our freezer at this point, but various proprietary strains that customers have banked with us as well are in there. So it's pretty extensive, the number of different yeast strains we have. But overall, the process is pretty hands off at this point. I mean, when a new strain is maybe submitted to us, we go through the process of making sure it's a pure culture, that we isolate that specific yeast strain, grow it to a volume that is sufficient for us to store it. For the most part, the yeast are kind of just sleeping away in a negative 80-degree freezer, and they're alive and viable, but they're not really doing anything. And that's kind of the goal. Most yeast labs will be using a negative 80-degree freezer in order to keep the genetics of the yeast stable. That's really the goal. In order to like keep a yeast alive, you can keep it in a freezer for a pretty long time. Like I've grown up strains that were made close to 30 years ago. But generally like 10 years or so is a good ballpark for how long you should turn over your vials in the negative 80-degree freezer. And we do that in order to prevent constantly maintaining a live organism on like auger plates or auger slants, because every time you transfer it to a new growth medium, it's replicating. There's chance for genetic drift, mutations to occur. So honestly, the less we touch them, the better. When we do need to go back to our freezer and grow up a strain, we just make sure that we have our quality control checks in place to make sure it's growing properly, that it's free of contaminants, and that it's producing the same sensory profile that we expect out of that strain.
Okay. So do you have some sort of a timetable schedule? You say, okay, well, yeast strain 1, 2, 3, 4 has been in there for 10 years. I need to go ahead and do the cycling again and then freeze it for another 10 years? Or what dictates the point at which you have to turn them over and refreeze them?
Yeah, so or any vial that you have in the freezer, when it's removed from the freezer, it'll start to thaw and warm, and so it really shouldn't go back into the freezer at that point. So we've got like a set number of vials that once they're removed from the freezer and used to create a new stock culture, we have a finite number of those vials available. So when we're running low, then we'll have to go through that procedure again of making more vials and storing them cryogenically and using them until they run out again.
Okay.
We start all of our propagations from slants, which are just an agar medium stored in a refrigerator. And those last for a fairly long time as well. And so every batch of slants is made from the archived culture in the freezer, but then we call that our working culture would be our slants, and every propagation is started from a slant. That way we're maintaining like a pretty consistent product, and the genetics of every pitch are hopefully identical.
So let's just say for any particular yeast strain that you have available, How much of that do you make, like in a quote unquote batch to package up for resale?
Oh man, a lot. At least in homebrewer volumes, it would be, man, I don't know the math on how many homebrew packages it would be. We don't have massive tanks just because we prefer to do smaller batches more frequently in order to make sure the product's fresh because it is perishable. For our bigger selling strains like 1056, 1318, we'll go up to about 20 barrels in a propagation vessel that can provide a lot of slurry. Exactly how many activator package that is, I'd have to do the math for you and get
Yeah,
back. But
20 barrels of yeast is a lot.
that's barrelage of propagation media, and so we don't necessarily. And then once we separate the yeast from the media, it's a smaller volume, but it's a pretty dense slurry of yeast at that point. It can provide probably thousands of activators in those 20 barrel tanks. So
Sure. And I think from the commercial standpoint, you have even larger packages, right?
yeah, for commercial customers, it's pretty much custom order. We do like half-liter increments, and the limit doesn't really exist. We've got some pretty large commercial breweries that'll order over 100 liters of yeast slurry at a time, and we standardize all of our product to a concentration of about 1 × 10⁹ cells per mil. So it's a really dense slurry. So the math gets kind of crazy at that point when you're working in with numbers like that and doing cell counts. But we're happy to offer pretty customizable pitch rates for all of our brewing customers, depending on their goals.
Yeah, it's amazing when you think about those little single-celled guys and how much work they do, and just the amount of mass that they can increase to when you put them in your fermenter and have them start chewing on the wort.
Yeah, they're good at what they do, that's for sure.
Yeah, you've used a couple terms that I'm not familiar with. You've talked about slant. You've talked about auger plates. Those must be laboratory type terminologies because I've never heard of those before. Could you just share a little bit about what those things are?
Totally. I guess they're actually both pretty similar. An auger plate is like a petri dish. Have you maybe heard
I
that term?
have,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Same thing. The petri dish is like the plastic dish, and then it's filled with an agar medium. And agar is just a compound that creates like a jello type substance. So it'll turn your liquid into a solid when it cools down. And so that's what we use for growing our yeast cultures on, as well as for detecting contamination. The media, which is just like the growth medium, the sugar and nutrient solution that you use in those petri dishes. It can be either used to grow yeast well, it can be used to grow bacteria and kill yeast, which would be like a selective medium. And that's how we can detect for like bacteria contamination. We have like differential mediums where different yeast strains will look different on those plates. So that's how we can make sure we have like the correct strain and part of our QC program. And then a slant is just a petri dish basically, but it's in like a small glass vial and it's got a cap on it. And so it's just basically a petri dish that you can store for a long time in a refrigerator. And so once you grow your yeast on the auger in the slant, once it's in the refrigerator, it's not quite as efficient as the freezer. They won't last for, 10 plus years, but they'll last for a few months and they'll stay in a viable living state so that we can take some of that live yeast and then initiate a propagation from there.
Yeah, thanks. So one of the things as a home brewer that I know is that, cleanliness is next to godliness when it comes to beers. So do you work in a lab most of the time then?
Yeah, I'm mostly in the QC lab, and our QC lab does like the first half of every propagation. So if we're growing a strain, it starts in pretty small scale. Like I said, it starts with the slant. So you're taking a relatively small number of cells and you're transferring it into like a liquid broth at that point, like a growth medium, and then you're slowly stepping it up, usually in like 1 to 10 increments of volume. So if you start with like 10 mils, you'll go to 100 mils to a liter. And that's pretty small volume. So most of that gets handled in the lab. And so everything that's basically being used in the lab has gone through an autoclave. So it's like a really intense pressure cooker, basically, where you can actually get sterilization. And then we get to work in like a laminar flow hood. So it's like a stainless steel bench top that blows sterile air on you. So your entire workspace is clean and you don't have to worry about contaminants falling into the air, which can happen.
Sure,
You're
sure.
not.
Yeah, that's where wild yeast comes from.
Yeah, exactly. So the QC lab does a lot of the propagation work and it's a pretty clean environment, thankfully.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
another thing that I was noticing on your website, which again I think is pretty cool, again having kind of a science background myself, is that you actually have screenshots showing what the yeast variety looks like. It's pretty cool to see like the differentiation between, one from the other, and even like I don't know if the amount of yeast cells that show up there are like true to life.
Well, yeah, those are actually fairly new. Our previous quality lab manager, actually, she took all those pictures in our lab with our microscope. So those are like wet mount slides. So we're actually just scraping a very tiny amount of yeast, probably off like an agar plate, when she did it, and then just putting it in a little bit of water and then putting it on like a classic microscope glass slide. So the exact like concentration of yeast, it's probably not too good for like thinking about that so much. But what that does show is it'll show like cell shape. There's different shapes of cells, whether they're more round or more like football shaped or lemon shaped, or with the wild yeast as well. They'll grow those long pseudo hyphae, or like very long and skinny, which are kind of interesting. So it will show cell shape, and it'll also show the tendency of the that yeast strain to be like clumpy, as you kind of noticed, or give an idea of like how flocculent that yeast might be. And it provides a resource for like maybe any brewer that's using our yeast. And a microscope is one of the most important pieces of equipment a beer lab can have, not for only for detecting contaminants, but if you're familiar with your yeast strain, you can just take a sample of it, look it under the scope, and make sure that you have the correct strain that you think you're using
Sure,
based
that makes
on cell
sense.
shape and how it's behaving with other cells.
Sure. So you've mentioned a couple terms, flocculation, concentration. Can you share with my listeners some of the more important characteristics of yeast that differentiate themselves from each other?
Totally. I think one of the most important ones is the species. Maybe step one is knowing if you're going to make an ale or a lager, and those are going to be two different species of yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae or Saccharomyces pastorianus. So we list out all the species on our website. So that's a pretty good resource. But yeah, I think that's an important place to start is knowing the species, for sure. If you're doing ale or lager, or if you're using wild yeast like Brettanomyces. And then there's also the diastaticus variant of Saccharomyces, which is kind of a hot topic these days because some people see it as a contaminant. Others prefer to use it because it makes really highly attenuated beers that are nice and dry and tend to have that like farmhouse character. So that's listed on our website as well if it's one of these diastatic strains of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And then we tend to give, general like descriptors as far as what temperature range the yeast will like to ferment at. That's pretty closely tied to ale and lager yeast as well. The lager yeasts are more tolerant to the cold temperatures. We'll give an indicator of like how flocculent the yeast is, which is can be helpful if a brewer likes to make a very clear beer or if they like to harvest yeast from the bottom of their tanks. Um, Other brewers might want a less flocculent yeast if they're making a wheat beer and they want that nice hazy appearance. We give a general indication of like attenuation, so how much sugar the yeast tends to consume. That'll be important for like the amount of sweetness left over in the beer mostly is how you can think about attenuation. If that percentage value is really high, it consumes a lot of sugar, it'll leave a drier beer, and then vice versa. And then when it comes to like picking a yeast strain, understanding its flavor profile, which is kind of a hard thing to put into like a metric, but it takes some experience. And we try to give general guidelines of, if it's a yeast that'll produce a lot of fruity esters, or if it's one of these farmhouse strains that'll have a more phenolic spiciness. Those are kind of the main yeast characteristics that a brewer should start to look for when they're making a recipe.
Last call.
It's nearly time to wrap things up, but first, one more for the road. This episode, I'm drinking Dark Star Imperial Oatmeal Stout from Fremont Brewing in Seattle, Washington. From the brewer, roasty chocolate tones swirled with oatmeal smoothness and dark as the night. The Dark Star crashes, pouring its light into ashes. So follow as the Lady of Velvet recedes in the nights of goodbye. This one is too smooth, and at 8% ABV, dangerous. So without further delay, so as mentioned, this is an 8% ABV Imperial Oatmeal Stout. I actually had this one back in 2019 when I found it on Tavour. When I was in Seattle recently, I grabbed a 6-pack and brought a few of them back for my friends because it is so darn good. So I poured this out into a tulip glass. It pours a very deep dark color, and it has a nice fluffy mocha head. On the nose, I get a little bit of smokiness, maybe a little bit of roastiness there as well. First sip impression, yeah. This is so smooth and delicious. I do get that roastiness on the palate. Like I said, it's smooth and it almost borders on being just decadent chocolate there. Definitely hints of dark chocolate on the palate. And interestingly, this seems to lean a little bit more into the bitterness as opposed to the sweetness that some stouts might have. In fact, the more that I drink this, the more I think this almost reminds me a little bit of a Russian Imperial Stout kind of vibe. Very good. And at 8%, it's going to hit you, but it's not going to crush you per se. Man, this beer is so good. I would say that this is good anywhere, anytime, in any season. So I give this one 4 tasters out of 5 on the Flightboard. Cheers, Fremont Brewing. I'm always looking for new craft beverages to review. So if you've got one from your favorite local craft brewery, meadery, or cidery you'd like me to drink and describe, reach out and let me know. Before I wrap things up, I want to take a moment to remember and honor the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, who passed away at the end of 2024. President Carter's connection to beer might be best known through his brother Billy, who stumped for Fall River Brewing's Billy Beer Light Lager. However, for those of us who homebrew and enjoy craft beer, his legacy is a bit more important than that. For those that might not be aware, on October 14, 1978, President Carter signed H.R. 1337 into law. This lifted the federal ban on homebrewing that had been in place since Prohibition, unlocking an unending world of experimentation and unlimited creativity. This law gave people the power and freedom to craft unique and flavorful brews, thus effectively kickstarting the American craft beer movement. So the next time you drink a craft beer, raise your glass in honor of President Carter. That's all for this episode of the 5 Beer Plan. With so many podcasts out there, thanks for choosing to listen to mine. Join me next time as I correct a previous gaffe, kick off the next homebrew project, terminate my chat with Robert Beezer, and review another beer. Remember to hit the subscribe button on your preferred podcast platform to be notified of new episodes. Follow me on Instagram as well, 5 Beer Plan 2022, to see what is happening on my personal ale trail. I'd love to hear from you, and there are several ways you may do so. Leave a comment for this episode on Spotify, direct message me on Instagram, or email me directly, 5beerplan@frontier.com. Be sure to support your local breweries, choose your beers wisely, and drink them responsibly. Until next time, keep walking your ale trail, and stay thirsty, my friends.